Disclaimer, I do not have all the answers, nor do I claim to have all the answers. Do not treat what I say as gospel, and do not use it to talk down to aspiring writers. I'm just summarizing other people's ideas. Check the description for more information, and now on with the video. This video is a continuation of our discussion on story structure. In the last video, we looked at some common story models used by writers, but then we backed up to ask what even is a story to begin with. And most narratologists would agree that a story is a representation of a story world undergoing a non-habitual disruption. Then we looked at the story and discourse model of a narrative work, mainly focusing on the events, specifically the events that change a story world, the kernel events, and the events that show the changes in action, the satellite events. Now, we're not going to cover story world in this video because that's characters and settings, and either you already know about characters and settings or we could just save it for another time. So today we are mainly going to focus on the discourse, how we can turn events into a narrative work. In the last video, I defined a narrative as a representation of a story world undergoing change in a meaningful way for a target audience. So today we're going to cover a little more in depth how we get that story packaged to the target audience, starting with the classic communication model developed by the Greek rhetoricians. They believe that an author was solely responsible for a text, in this case a narrative work, and that text would then go directly to the audience. Now, as nice as this model is, it ignores a lot of context, different audience opinions, and so on and so forth. So narratologists would later improve on this model, resulting in this. This model was developed by various narratologists, Roland Barthes, Gerald Prince, Wayne C. Booth, Seymour Chapman, among others. In this, the actual author is writing for an implied audience, who they think the audience is and how they'll react, while the actual audience reacts to an implied author, who they think the author is and why they wrote the work. It also accounts for a narrator, somebody telling the story who's not necessarily the author, and the narratee, who the author is telling the story to, who is not necessarily the audience. Now, as nice as this model is, it still doesn't account for one more thing: how the audience gives feedback back to the author. This can be seen in improv theater. When a show stops getting laughs, the improv troupe has to change their tactics. Or if a show starts getting bad reviews, the showrunners have to switch up their writing. So this model ended up going through one more recent evolution. The rhetorical narratologist James Phelan, who, as of this video, his works are publicly available on the Ohio State University Knowledge Bank, developed this model. Now, unlike the previous model in which an author writes a text for a passive audience, the audience is now an active participant, and their reaction to the text influences the author. In Phelan's words, a narrative is a dance between an author and an audience, and that dance is done in the resources. This includes the genre, the title, the subtitles, everything from pictures to covers, anything that you can add to a text to create a narrative experience. This model also expands what's known as the limits of narrative. Previously, it was said you could not make narratives out of things like lists or instruction manuals or data and experiment logs. But now, thanks to this resource model, you don't necessarily need explicit events to tell a story. And a fine example of this would be the SCP Foundation, which tells fine narratives using nothing but containment procedures, experiment logs, and so on. So if a narrative is a dance between an author and an audience, let's look at the dance steps, all contained within the discourse of the story and discourse model. First, we will look at the structure, which includes the narrative instance, who is telling the story to who, on what occasion, and in what tense. Narrative time and space, in what order are the events told, and how long does each event take up narrative space. The more detail, the more space it takes. And then the narrative levels. This includes everything from titles to subtitles to paratext, metatext, intertext, and stories within stories. And then you've got the presentation. In what way is the story told? On what medium? Is it visual? Is it auditory? Is it interactive like a video game? The meta-narrative, which is the mood of the content itself of the story, and then the style and tone, which is the mood of the way it's presented. In this particular video, we are only going to focus on structure. We're going to save presentation for next time. First, let's take a closer look at narrative instance. Now, this is all some classic English class stuff, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. First, we got narrative perspective. Is it told from an omniscient point of view, the author tells us everything, or a limited point of view, we only get a few details, either because the author wants to hide some things or to simulate what it's like to have the limited perspective of a character within the story? You got temporality. Is it told from a past tense, a present tense, or in some rare cases, a future tense? Then you got narrative voice. Who is telling the story to who? Is it a removed narrator from outside the story, or is it a character within the story? And are they telling it to the all-seeing audience or to another character within the story, a narratee? I say this is classic English class stuff because you can use these to make any of the tenses you're normally taught in school. For example, if you want to do third person omniscient, that would be omniscient, past, narrator, audience, third person limited. Limited, past, narrator, audience, or first person present tense, that would be limited, present, character, audience. Or if you want to do one of those epistolary stories of a character telling another character, that would be limited, past, character, narratee. Now, while we picked up a lot of information about narrative instance through English class, we picked up information on narrative time and space through general writing advice. Order includes, is it told in a linear timeline, or do we use flashbacks and flash forwards, or the fancy terms analepsis and prolepsis? The duration, do we show versus tell? Showing tends to take up more time, so we tell to speed things up through either a montage or a narrator summing everything up. And frequency is, do we repeat the same events? Do we go back and change things like in time travel stories? Do we reuse the same setup and punchline like in some sketches? Do we have a Groundhog's Day plot where one character re-experiences the same event but with different outcomes? Or a Rashomon plot where different characters recount the same event from different perspectives? But it doesn't explain why we play with time and space. We play with time and space to alter the hermeneutics. That is, how reveals affect an audience's experience of the narrative. To sum up the work of narratologist Roland Barthes, hermeneutics is governed by two things: enigmas and revelations. Enigmas are the unanswered dramatic questions about the characters, the setting, and the plot. This creates curiosity in the audience, wanting to know the backstory behind the story world and how will the plot turn out. The answers to these enigmas are the revelations, the reveals. Instead of curiosity, we now have new context behind the story and the story world, and we are now filled with concern for the characters. We can empathize with the good ones more and the bad ones less, and it changes our experience of the story. When somebody tells you no spoilers, it's because they want to experience a story with the enigmas intact. Spoilers kill enigmas. But this is not always necessarily a bad thing. For example, sometimes you can have a story that spoils its own plot with a flash forward at the very beginning and some sort of major event later. Now, instead of curiosity, your audience is now filled with dread and suspense. How did it get this way? How are things going to turn out? And then finally, what's going to happen after we get to the point where we flash forward to at the beginning? Then on the first viewing, they'll be curious, and then depending on how things turn out, they'll either be delightfully amused or we'll have even more dread knowing things are going to get worse. Or let's say we have a story that includes a flashback around the 2/3 mark. We meet a character that we like, they act kind of peculiar, they do some strange things, but we think they're our buddy. And then we get a flashback revealing they're actually betraying us the whole time. Suddenly we find out they're the villain, and that leads to this massive plot twist in the final third of the story. But it doesn't just affect the final third of the story. We look back at all the suspicious stuff the character was doing, we look at that flashback, it explains all this, it affects the entire story. So now, upon repeat viewings, we know that this character was doing some really shady stuff all along. Now, before we move on, you might be wondering, where would exposition fit as far as hermeneutics go? Well, let's go back to Labov's diamond of the orientation, disruption, evaluation, and resolution. Exposition is normally used for the orientation. It grounds the story world. It tells you how everything works. Now, where you're going to find the major changes and reveals would be in your disruption, where the big plot twists happen, where the big reveals happen, where a character does something that radically changes things, and the long-term changes and reactions would fit under the evaluation. The story stuff, the big hermeneutic stuff, is going to be up here, and the exposition stuff, either grounding the story or showing how the world changed, is going to fit down here. And finally, you can convey a lot of narrative information throughout the narrative levels. This includes paratext. That's your titles, your subtitles, your captions, your covers. That conveys a lot of information about your story. You can use intertext. You can reference other works. You can reference quotes, stories. You can do parodies, homages, allusions. You can have hyper and hypotext when you modify an original work and make something new out of it, like taking the Elizabethan tragedy Romeo and Juliet and making the modern-day gang epic West Side Story. You got metatext. Your commentary and description can add to your storytelling experience. Architext, when you switch from one genre and style to another. For example, Full Metal Jacket is mostly a narrative, but at one point it switches to a documentary style. Relevancy. You can focus on things that are only explicit to the narrative that have 100% to do with the story, or you can focus on things that are only implicit to the narrative, or you can focus on something that has nothing to do with the narrative, as seen in anti-plot stories, absurd plots, and the French New Wave. You also have metalepsis. This is when the narrator weighs in on the story events and gives their own personal commentary. And finally, you have stories within stories, which repeat all of these all the way down. Now, before I wrap up this video, let's take a closer look at relevancy, because in the past, both I and other writing tutors have said, don't show the scene where nothing happens. But if you look at the disruption model and then you apply it to slice of life and minimalist stories, you can tell a lot of story with very little happening. And that can be explained thanks to narrative relevancy. This model can be applied to both events as a whole and the things you focus on within the events, or the focalization. You can be explicit, it has 100% to do with the story. Predictive, it foreshadows events or is only partially related to the things that have happened in the story. Thematic, it has very little to do with the actual story itself, but has to do with the themes and ideas. Persuasive, it's tangentially related to the themes and ideas. Distractive, it has nothing to do with the story, but it can still be used for red herrings and for world building. Then finally, obstructive, scenes that deliberately get in the way of the story, which can still be used for absurd plots. My point is, if we were to only focus on explicit events, we would be missing out on all the nuance and practicality that all the other event types give us. There is no such thing as a bad event, just a misused event. You can still use distractive and obstructive events to throw the audience off or add a quick gag. You can use predictive, thematic, and persuasive events to build the world, to build an atmosphere, to create a mood. Not everything has to be 100% explicit. And if you look at any slice of life story, you'll find they use this entire palette of relevancy. Wrapping up, we take the events, we find out who's telling the story to who on what occasion, we find out the time and order of the events, and then we distribute the information across the narrative levels. According to the narratologist Wolf Schmidt, the process kind of looks like this. We start with our various events, we pick the events we want to focus on, and then boom, we build the narrative out of that. So it looks like we're out of time. We only covered half of the discourse part of the story and discourse model of narrative. Next time we are going to cover presentation, which includes meta-narrative, which is a huge topic unto itself. We'll cover that next time. In the meantime, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll answer as soon as I can. I will see you all later, and good luck in your writing endeavors.